thank you for inviting me to talk to members and guests of the Friends of the Dales this evening. So as Ken said, I'm a lecturer in German and Translation Studies at the University of Leeds, but I'm actually a resident of Skipton, and I live literally just round the corner from the site of the camp, from where this camp was situated in 1915 up until 1920. And I've been working on the camp, researching the German prisoners since 2015. So today I'm going to talk to you about how the German prisoners spent Christmas 1918 in the camp. And I'm also going to tell you the story of two of the officers who were part of that group who were here in 1918, and how they spent their previous few Christmases in various continents around the world. I'm going to start by introducing you to one of the prisoners. So this man here is Heinrich Hase, the man sitting down. For him, Christmas 1918 was his fourth Christmas in captivity, in British captivity. For about 20 of the prisoners in the camp, it was actually their fifth Christmas in British captivity. So we're going to find out a little bit about Heinrich Hase and then go on to learn about how he spent Christmas 1918 in Skipton. So he was born in 1892 in the town of Schlangen, which is between Dortmund and Kassel. Like many families in the area, his family were farmers, but when Heinrich left school, he went to work in a brickworks. He was always a keen gymnast, and he was a member of his local gymnastics club. In 1914, he was called up to serve in the German army, called into Infantry Regiment 57. But then in 1915, in May, he was taken prisoner on the Western Front. He spent his first Christmases in the UK, in the Scottish borders, in Stubbs. I think I've mentioned to you already that we're joined today by Andy Jepson, who's the archaeologist up at the Stubbs camp in Hawick. Well worth a visit. So Christmas 1915, Christmas 1916, Heinrich Hase spent in Scotland, in Hawick. And between 1916 and 1917, he went to the Brockton camp in Staffordshire. But then he was transferred yet again to Catterick camp in North Yorkshire, where he spent Christmas 1917. And we can see here, this is a Christmas card that was designed by the prisoners at Catterick in 1917. You can see the date here on the bottom of the card, and it says, "Christmas greetings from the prisoner of war camp." This was found by Heinrich's family among his photographs. We're not sure if he actually sent it home or whether he brought it home himself. So Heinrich was then transferred to Skipton in the May of 1918. At this point, I'll just give you a bit of background about the camp in Skipton for those people who haven't heard me speak before and aren't really aware of the camp. So here's a picture of the camp, and this is Skipton's famous landmark hill, Sharphaw, and then Roughhaw there next to it. So Raikeswood Camp was built in 1915, originally as a training camp for the Bradford POWs. Various other regiments trained here, and then the camp lay empty once all the British soldiers had gone off to the Western Front. So towards the end of 1917, Britain started capturing ever-increasing numbers of Germans, and somewhere was needed to accommodate them. So these empty military training camps were an obvious place to house the German prisoners. The camp in Skipton opened here in January 1918, and the first arrivals were actually transferees from the camp in Colsterdale, which is at the top of Nidderdale. So 150 officers arrived from Colsterdale in January 1918. And gradually numbers increased so that the peak occupancy of Raikeswood Camp was approximately 560 officers and 120 men. So Heinrich Hase was one of those men. and his rank was that of Gemeiner in German, which is equivalent to a private. So the camp in Skipton was primarily an officers' camp. There were actually about 700 prisoner of war camps in the UK, and most of them were camps for non-officers who would be sent out to work in forestry, in quarrying and in agriculture. But only 18 of those camps were officers' camps. And the men, the non-officers who were held in the officers' camps, were basically there as servants to the officers. So they would do the cleaning, the cooking, they would act as barbers, cobblers, tailors, carpenters, and do any work that was required in the camp. So we can see on this photo, here's Heinrich Hauser, and he's in a group here of fellow non-officers, and it looks like they've just been playing football. So I'm going to tell you now how these non-officers spent Christmas in the camp, before then going on to talk about the officers' Christmas. Social class and military rank was quite significant in those days, so the officers and the non-officers celebrated Christmas separately. So they managed to find a small tree to put in each of their barracks. The non-officers were about 34 men to a barracks. So they had a small tree in each of the barracks, and they decorated it with paper and cotton. Food rations for the men had not been plentiful, but the kitchen staff had managed to be thrifty leading up to Christmas, and they did their best to provide the men with food suitable for the festive occasion. On Christmas Eve, each man got a bowl of fried potatoes, which they were delighted about, and then they went to the religious services for the Catholics and the Lutherans. So on Christmas morning for breakfast, they had coffee with milk and cake. And to quote the words of the Deputy Sergeant Major, the cake had proper raisins, it was properly baked with proper sugar on top. However, at this point, many of the men were thinking of their families back home. There were huge food shortages in Germany, and they knew that their families would not be enjoying such a festive meal. And here's a quote from the Deputy Sergeant Major. He says that with every bite came the sad realization that our loved ones at home would certainly not have such a festive breakfast. I'm convinced that many of us would rather have packed up the whole glorious thing and sent it home. So at midday, the men had a meal of goulash, followed by custard. And then in the afternoon, they all went to the hut that they knew as the Old Mess. So this is the hut they went to, and this is a sketch drawn by one of the prisoners. So at one end of the hut, they'd put a Christmas tree, and the tables had been covered in white cloths and arranged into a horseshoe. Each man received a mug of festive cocoa, and the men were honoured because they were joined by the senior German officer for their Christmas celebrations. So there was carol singing, and if we look here, you can see the top carol, that's the words in German of the carol Silent Night, so Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht. And this is the actual song sheet that they had in the camp at that Christmas in 1918. So the next thing that happened in the non-officers' Christmas was the arrival of Ruprecht. So this is Ruprecht, and he's St. Nicholas's manservant. And Ruprecht arrived carrying presents for everybody. And these included pocket knives, tobacco pipes, cigar holders, cigarette holders, board games, shaving soap and braces. And each parcel also contained a verse that took the mickey out of the recipient of the parcel. And according to the Deputy Sergeant Major, these verses were not always suitable for polite society. And there was lots of laughter as the verses were read out. So this sketch of Ruprecht was drawn by one of the prisoners as part of a Christmas card competition. The British War Office had allowed each of the prisoners to send 10 cards back home to their families in Germany. So the prisoners organised a competition within the camp to design cards that would be printed to send home. And this is one of those cards, and this is another. So later on, these celebrations continued into the evening, and there was lots of singing and dancing. So these are some of the pieces of music and some of the dances that took place. So we had a vocal octet singing Beethoven's Hymn to the Night, a vocal quartet singing an amusing piece called Der Speisezettel, which means the menu, and that's by Zollner. So if anybody is interested in choir music, choral music, this is actually quite funny. It's a group of men singing the menu to somebody supposedly in a restaurant. And if you just Google Der Speisezettel by Zollner on YouTube, you'll get a really amusing rendition of this. There was a Viennese Schrammelband. This is traditional Viennese folk music with 2 violins and a guitar. And then there was a Schuhplattler folk dance group. This was a Bavarian type of folk dance that had a lot of knee slapping going on. And then some of the men stood up and did some stand-up comedy routines. Okay, so moving on to the officers' celebrations. These started on the 22nd and 23rd of December with a Christmas concert performed by the Officers' Orchestra. And you can see here, this is actually the program for that concert, and you can see some of the music that they played. You can spot Brahms there, Engelbert Humperdinck, Berlioz. So I should probably explain at this point that according to the Hague Convention of 1907, officer prisoners could not be permitted to work. So the officers in the camp had to find something to occupy their time and also to give their lives some sort of purpose. So they organised all kinds of activities in the camp. Music was very important to the Germans. So they had an orchestra, they had a choir, a theatre group, they organised an education system, and they played all sorts of sports. And a lot of the equipment, the sheet music, the instruments, the costumes for the theatre group were provided by charities. One of the main charities was organised by a Dr. Markle, who was based down in London. And Colin Chapman, who's with us tonight, is in the process of writing a biography of Dr. Markle and finding out about all the charity work that he did. So this is the hut that they used as the concert hall and the theatre. And again, this is a sketch drawn by one of the prisoners. So on Christmas Eve, there were religious services for the officers in the late afternoon, and carols again, and a performance by the male voice choir. And the celebrations continued after that on Christmas Eve evening with a meal in the messes. And this is the menu. So this was 8 p.m. in the messes. They enjoyed wine soup, lobster mayonnaise, roast pork with red cabbage, mashed potato, fruit, butter and cheese, coffee, and Christmas Stollen. So after the meal, they had a raffle for cakes and custards from the kitchen, and then Father Christmas arrived with a sack of presents. All the presents for the officers had been made by fellow German prisoners in some of the non-officers' camps in the UK. And these included cigar and cigarette holders, wallets, pocket knives, and letter openers. And with every present, there was a verse written especially for each man. So we have here in translation one of the verses. So this was for a man who was keen on carpentry, and he was given a hammer. So, who is it hammers from sunrise till late at night? It's no surprise. He thinks the barracks has to be a workshop for his carpentry. Ah, yes, Anon, we're sick and tired. If we'd a choice, we'd have you fired. It's true that everything you do shows an ambition, grand and true, for carpentry. But give it a rest, delay your efforts, don't be a pest. better if your banging abated until we're all repatriated. So that was for one of them who was obviously annoying them with his carpentry efforts. So the evening for the officers continued in the messes. Remember, there were over 500 officers, so they wouldn't all fit into the old mess or to the concert hall, so they divided themselves into smaller groups in the messes. And there were performances by violinists and the choir. There were recitals and punch and wine served by the orderlies. So these were the non-officers, men like Heinrich Haase. And they were allowed by the English administration of the camp to continue celebrating until 1 a.m. So on Christmas Day, on the 25th of December, the prisoners woke to see snow on the surrounding hills. Many of the officers started their day with a walk around the camp. And as I mentioned, with there being over 500 of them, they celebrated on Christmas Day in their individual barracks. The officers were about 24 men to a barracks, with some of the more senior officers being given smaller rooms. So leading up to Christmas, each barracks had set up a Christmas committee to make the preparations, and they'd managed to get a tree for each barracks, and they placed it in the coal scuttle in the centre of the hut by the stove. They used bed sheets as tablecloths, and they sung carols and folk songs, and some of the men made speeches. So on the 26th of December, the camp theatre performed the play called Turandot. It was written by the Venetian playwright Carlo Gozzi, based on a medieval Persian story of a Chinese princess who kills her suitors. It was then translated into German by Friedrich Schiller in 1801, and he reinterpreted it into the Romantic style. It's probably more well known as an opera by Puccini, but this wasn't actually released until 1926. So the theatre group had spent weeks making 20 elaborate costumes with fantastical headdresses, oriental swords and daggers, and they painted an elaborate stage set that included a giant Buddha. They set an entry fee of 1 shilling, which was a bit higher than their normal entry fee for the theatre productions, because of the extra effort that had gone into making the costumes and the extra effort that had gone into rehearsing. You'll see here that the Prince of Astrakhan is a certain Lieutenant Seames, and this is Friedrich Seames. So after the war, he went on to become a well-known actor and then theatre director in Germany. And here he is in his later years, and the helmet here, the Pickelhaube that you can see, and that's actually still in the possession of Friedrich Seames's family back in Germany, in Hamburg. So we haven't got very many pictures from the camp in Skipton. So I've got a picture here of prisoners rehearsing for a play, but this is from the Stobbs camp. But as you heard earlier, some of the men who were at Skipton had previously been at Stobbs, so there may be some of the Skipton men on this picture. We've got a picture here from Heinrich Haase's collection, and this we think was taken during a theatre performance at Skipton, but not the Christmas performance. So continuing the Christmas celebrations into New Year's Eve, on the 31st of December, the officers gathered in the messes again to bring in the new year. Again, they drank wine and punch, and they had conjurers, people in fancy dress, and they sang songs and poems inspired by the camp. And I've got one of their song sheets here, and it was obviously a little bit more light-hearted at New Year than it had been at Christmas. So they've changed the words to this song. This is the song, "Oh Christmas Tree, Oh Christmas Tree," but they've changed it to "Oh Prisoner, Oh Prisoner." And there are 10 humorous verses. I've translated one of them here. I haven't made it rhyme, but you'll get the gist. So, oh prisoner, how scarce is England's coal? You can only warm your head and feet for a short time. That is grim. O prisoner, how scarce is England's coal. And here we have a sketch drawn by one of the prisoners of the orderlies collecting coal for the camp. So how do we know about the prisoners' Christmas celebrations in so much detail? Well, in 1920, a book was published in Munich after the men had been repatriated, and it contains a lot of detailed information about their time in the camp. It was compiled by two men, Fritz Saxer and Willy Kostmann, but actually contains the work of 60 of the prisoners in the camp. So it contains descriptions of the camp, its location and the surroundings. It's really interesting for me as a resident of Skipton to read descriptions of the town where I live as seen through the eyes of the Germans. So for example, they describe the church tower at the top of the high street as stubby. And I'd never thought of it as being stubby, but of course, if you compare our square church towers to the tall spires that you see in Germany, then it would look stubby to them. We get diary entries from individual men, detailed accounts of daily life. There are sketches, poems, a description of the impact of major events such as Christmas and the armistice. And what we really get that's quite unique is the German perspective on the war and the experience of imprisonment. And this is possibly the most detailed account in existence of life in a British prisoner of war camp during the First World War. So that was Christmas and New Year 1918 leading into 1919. So 1919 was a very difficult year for the German prisoners here in Skipton. The Spanish flu that was going around the world hit the camp very hard in February and March 1919, and 47 of the men lost their lives to that disease. So you can see here we've got a funeral of one of the men. The funerals took place down at Keighley, Morton Cemetery. The men had been treated in Moreton Banks Hospital, it was also known as Keighley War Hospital, and then those that died were buried at the cemetery there, Moreton Banks Cemetery. So here's another photograph of one of the funerals. So this man here in the dark coat, this is Fritz Saxer, and he'd taken over as senior German officer of the camp in March 1919. I want to talk to you a little bit about Saxer because where he spent his previous Christmases is quite an interesting story. So Saxer was a naval captain, and when war broke out, he was in Germany's colony in China. The main city of this colony was Tsingtao. This was also the port. Some of you may have drunk Tsingtao beer in Chinese restaurants. So the brewery in Tsingtao was actually founded by the Germans in the late 1800s when they set up their colony there, and it still exists to this day. So Saxer, as I mentioned, was a naval captain. This is his ship, the Iltis. So he was there in 1914 when war broke out. He was there in the German colony in the main city of Tsingtao. Another man who was there was this man, Herbert Strehler. So Strehler was younger than Saxer. At this point, he would have been 27, but Strehler had been in Tsingtao for a few years before the war broke out. And this is from Christmas 1912, which Strehler spent in Tsingtao. So there's the Christmas tree you can see there. And this is a photograph taken by Strehler of the buildings in the German colony of Tsingtao. So when war broke out in the summer of 1914, the British asked the Japanese to support them against the Germans in the Pacific. And there was a siege in Tsingtao, which ended with the Germans being defeated in November 1914. And in the process of this, Saxe scuttled his ship, the Iltis, and the other German ships of the fleet were also scuttled. So Saxe and Strehla were taken as prisoners to Japan with the rest of their comrades. 4,700 Germans in total were taken prisoner to various camps in Japan. So Saxe and Strehla were imprisoned in the camp at Fukuoka. And so Christmas 1914, they spent in Japanese captivity in Fukuoka. So after around a year in captivity in Japan, in November 1915, 5 of the officers imprisoned in Fukuoka managed to escape. They did so separately. They'd made separate plans to escape, thinking they had less chance of being detected, and the camp interpreter helped them with their escape plans. So Saxe, for example, was given a Frenchman's business card as fake ID. Business cards at that time were accepted as a form of ID. So Saxe was given this by the camp interpreter. So separately, Saxe and Strehla made their way by train through Japan, through Korea, and to Shanghai. They also crossed on a ferry at one point during that journey. When they got to Shanghai, they were looked after by the German embassy. So Christmas 1915, they spent in Shanghai. In a later memoir, Saxe wrote that if it hadn't been wartime and he hadn't been so concerned about how he was going to get back to Germany from Shanghai, then he would have counted the weeks there as some of the best of his life. There was a large German community in Shanghai, and it does sound like he got rather a lot of dinner invitations. So January 1916, Saxe and Strehla set off together to try to get home to Germany. They'd hired some Chinese servants and some mules for their luggage, and they were using the passports of 2 German teachers that had been acquired for them via the German embassy. So the plan was to travel west through China, through the Gobi Desert, and to get back into Europe through Afghanistan, Persia, and then into Turkey. So yeah, they set off with their servants and their mules and all their luggage. And in mid-April, they reached Karasha, which is now Kyrgyzstan. But at this point, they found their route blocked because the Chinese government had ordered local officials to stop any suspected Germans. So they had no choice but to return to Shanghai and try and get back to Germany through the States. So they arrived back in Shanghai on the 6th of June, 1916, and they parted company to get themselves onto ships to get to the USA. They arrived in Seattle separately, and then they separately crossed the US to reach New York. Saxe said in his memoir later that he stopped off in Chicago to visit some relatives during that journey. So from New York, they managed together this time to get onto a Norwegian ship. And then just outside, well, just off the Orkney Isles, the ship was stopped and searched by the British Navy. And after 26 hours hiding under a pile of mattresses in the laundry room, the 2 men were found. So at this point, they were traveling under these civilian IDs. They had the passports of the 2 German teachers. So they were taken to the civilian internment camp at Knockalo on the Isle of Man. So over 20,000 German civilians were held on the Isle of Man during the First World War. And there was another civilian internment camp at the capital, Douglas. If anyone gets the chance to go over, there's a fantastic visitor centre in the old primary school near Knockalo, and you can see some of the art that was created in the camp by the civilians. It's well worth a visit. So Saxe and Strehla spent 2 Christmases on the Isle of Man, Christmas 1916 and Christmas 1917. Then in June 1918, they heard rumours that there were officer exchanges happening between Britain and Germany. So they actually confessed as to their true identities in the hope that they would be exchanged as officers and repatriated back to Germany. But no such luck, and they were sent to Skipton instead. So they arrived in Skipton summer 1918 and spent the rest of the war here in Skipton. And as I mentioned, Saxe then became the senior German officer in the camp here. So when I was producing the translation of Kriegsgefangen in Skipton and looking to publish that in English, I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. One of the things I needed to do was to contact the descendants of Saxe, because he was the first named author of that book, in order to obtain the copyright permission to publish an English translation. And with the help of my friend Corinna Meiss, who I think is with us tonight, Corinna's in Germany, we managed to trace the grandchildren of Fritz Saxe. And I started communicating with one of the older grandchildren, Helmut Kehler, in Hamburg. And then he put me in touch with his younger brother, Wolf, who lives in London. And of course, they gave us permission to publish the English translation. And this is myself here with Wolf Kehler. Some of you might recognize Wolf. He's an actor who was in Raiders of the Lost Ark. And Wolf kindly came up to Skipton in July 2019 to open an information board that we've had made to go on the site of the camp and to mark the camp in Skipton. Okay, so going back to the start of our story today, what happened to Heinrich Haase? So Heinrich Haase was one of the non-officers in the camp, if you remember, here as a servant to the officers. So Heinrich Haase was repatriated with the rest of the German prisoners from Skipton in October 1919. And he went back to his family in Germany, and he went back to his hobbies of gymnastics. So this is him doing some gymnastics and music. So he was a member of a choir and he played the mandolin. So he got married in 1927 and had 2 daughters. And then, oh yes, so he went to work as a telegraph worker and then for the post office. In the Second World War, he was in his 50s. He didn't get called up initially, but even though he was in his 50s and he had heart problems, he was called up to serve again at the beginning of 1945. So this is him in his Second World War uniform. His family think that the reason he was called up at such an advanced age and with health problems is that he wasn't a member of the Nazi Party. So he was taken prisoner by the British again in 1945, but he was released about 6 weeks after the war ended in July that year. So he returned back to his family, back to his hobbies of gymnastics and music. And here we can see him celebrating Christmas in the 1960s with his children and his grandchildren. And we have actually been joined this evening by one of these grandchildren, Sylvia, from Munich. She's possibly had to leave by now because Sylvia has carried on in the family tradition and is a member of the choir, and it's Sylvia's choir practice this evening. Okay, so I've mentioned the translation of Kriegsgefangen in Skipton, the book written by the Germans. So that project started at the University of Leeds in 2015. So my colleague Caroline Summers started the project, and then I took over, and we involved staff and students at the university, and it was a collaborative translation. And then in 2018, I started the editing process with 2 local women, Alison Abbey and Ada Whitaker, and we sat down together and edited all this translation to make sure that it was consistent and that it read well. And it then went out to proofreaders, and I think we've got a couple of the proofreaders with us tonight, Heather Hughes and Christine King. So it was a huge amount of work trying to capture the voices of military men from a century ago and understand some of the military language that they used. And the book was published in English this year in February. It also contains an appendix that is a list of all the men who were imprisoned in the camp. That's the work of my partner Tris Kenny, who used the records of the International Red Cross in Geneva, which have now been put online. And we've also got research into individual men that you can see in the first chapter of that book. So if anyone's interested in finding out more about the camp, there's obviously the book. There are 2 project websites. One of those is my university website, and the other one was made professionally as part of the Craven and the First World War project, which was based at Craven Museum at Skipton during the First World War centenary, and that was funded by the Heritage Lottery Fund. And there's a Twitter account there, so I try to keep up to date if anything new is happening, if there's an article come out anywhere, or if I'm giving a talk anywhere, I'll always put that on the Twitter account, and you can see my email address there if you want to get in touch and ask any further questions. So thank you very much for coming along tonight, and I'm more than happy to take any questions when we're ready.